Give me a second. Good afternoon. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider. With you today is the editor-in-chief. That's me, Rina Zuckerman, and our guest today is Gabriel Narona. He is our resident specialist in sanctions. He has written an explosive article following his experience in the Trump administration. Some of the sanctions the article in the Tablet magazine reveals threaten to undo a lot of the work that he himself and his colleagues were doing in countering Iran's terrorism in the Middle East and in other nefarious activities. All of that threatens to undermine that hard work and put the world in even more danger in the event this works out as a result of the Vienna talks and its domination by Rob Malley. Turning to Gabriel today, there's a lot going on in that article. You mentioned a great number of various sanctions that the Biden administration has threatened or promised to lift as a result of Iranian pressure demands as gestures of goodwill or as a matter of Russia's handling of the negotiation process. Out of all of that, it seemed to me that the most definite and confirmed seemed to be the decision to lift the IRGC FTO designation. How certain is that?
Well, I wouldn't say that's the most certain. I think the final details of that are still being worked out. I've had one diplomat tell me that it is finalized. I've had another diplomat tell me that they're still negotiating final details of what that would look like. I think there will be, the United States has wanted it to be exchanged for commitments by the Iranians of future talks about Iran's regional activity and their terrorist activity. But look, if that's the United States position, that's an incredibly weak one. The reality is that Iranian commitments to talks are pretty much useless because, as we've seen in these negotiations, Iran has gotten everything it's asked for, and it's given nothing in return. So I almost don't even want further talks about regional issues because I'm afraid of what the United States would give up in exchange for worthless Iranian commitments. So I think we have to see. Right now the deal is a little bit on the ropes because of this play that the Russians are doing right now with trying to get sanctions immunity as part of this deal from any sanctions from the United States and the European Union. Really, what we're seeing is that Russia's war against Ukraine is now affecting the Iran talks, and so that is, while the Iran deal is a huge deal for the Biden administration, the war in Ukraine is far, far more significant on the larger international scale, and that's threatening to overshadow the talks here in Iran.
To what extent is Russia's negotiating position here, first of all, strong enough to have any effect, and just how much of the process have they been handling in the first place that they're making demands, and what type of sanctions are we talking about that they're demanding to be lifted?
Well, so Iran is part of the original JCPOA. They're a member of the Joint Commission, which is sort of the arbitrator over the deal, and so they are quite important. They've also been in the sort of details of the deal to be negotiated. They're also very involved in Iran's nuclear program. They're involved in downgrading Iran's uranium and helping ship it out of the country. So they're really an integral part of this deal. What Iran is most concerned about is that its trade with Iran would be sanctioned. So at the same time that Iran's central bank would be delisted from US sanctions, it's possible that the Russian central bank would be listed shortly under US sanctions or international sanctions. And so this is all getting complicated for Russia. The other thing that's going on at the same time is Russia is realizing that its greatest negotiating leverage over Ukraine is on the global energy market. And the prospect of Iran suddenly being able to sell a lot more oil, that made sense and was fine for Russia a month ago. But now its calculus has shifted slightly, and it is suddenly realizing that this deal isn't quite as advantageous to it in its current makeup as it was 2 weeks ago. And so I think you're seeing the Russians recalibrating their international negotiating positions and trying to adjust accordingly.
It seems to me that on the international stage, at least, Iran is kind of following Russia's lead in terms of on the invasion and essentially being the most supportive out of anyone of this current events, much more so than China even. Is there a chance that some of this has been pre-negotiated between Russia and Iran, allowing Russia to push its own advantage?
Well, I actually would be surprised by that. The Iranian delegation and Iranians back in Iran seem to be quite annoyed at Russia's recent negotiating positions, because it's sort of threatening to blow up a deal, which is incredibly in Iran's favor. But the other thing is, look, Iran and Ukraine have had very fraught tensions, especially since 2 years ago when Iran shot down the Ukrainian airliner PS-752. On January 8th, 2020. Since then, the Ukrainians have been very aggressive trying to get payment for the shoot down from Iran. Iran has been very reluctant to provide that. And so Iran is taking Russia's side very strongly in this invasion. They're basically saying, hey, Russia is our patron, and we're going to take their side in the war.
Very interesting, all things considered, that Russia too had an incident with civil aviation in the past war with Ukraine, and that they recently apparently also threatened civil aviation in the vicinity. So this seems to be, the two countries seem to be sharing the same playbook. Getting back to the issue of sanctions, aside from the RGC designation that seems to be at play, there's been a lot of individuals, entities that may be lifted in order to appease Iran and gain some traction on the deal. And all of them sound incredibly scary and disadvantageous to US interests, but which would you assess to be the most damaging out of the ones you've listed?
So they're the most unsavory ones, which are against some of Iran's worst terrorists and torturers and human rights abusers. And then there's the most dangerous ones, which are actually against Iran's economic entities that support and finance terrorism. Specifically there, I'm most worried about the sanctions being lifted on Iran's central bank, on Iran's National Development Fund, and on its oil industry, specifically on the National Iranian Oil Company, NIOC, and the National Iranian Tanker Company, NITSI. Those organizations directly fund the IRGC, which again is responsible for the deaths of over 600 Americans in Iraq, the deaths of thousands and hundreds of thousands of Syrians, and for terrorist attacks in over 35 countries. Those are the ones I'm most worried about. But if you look at the Biden administration is looking to lift sanctions on anyone sanctioned under the Supreme Leader's Office executive order. That includes President Raisi, who we know was involved in the executions of at least 5,000 Iranians. It includes sanctions being lifted on General IRGC General Dagan, who was involved in the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut in 1983 that killed 240 Americans and 58 French soldiers. And it lifts sanctions on two of the IRGC and top Iranians involved in the AMIA bombing in Argentina in 1994 that killed 85 Argentinian Jews. Those are the ones I'm most worried about, and it's a lot of them.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but IRGC has been directly involved in procuring uranium from various countries in various operations related to the nuclear program. For lifting the sanctions of the financing mechanisms that supports the activity, doesn't that put the likelihood of them returning to the cheating on the deal and illicit involvement in the program very high on Iran's priority list? Aren't they basically looking to get that financing back just so they could continue with the program?
Well, they wouldn't even need to do that because under the terms of the deal, Iran in just 9 years will have zero limitations on Iran uranium enrichment, both as a percentage and as a volume. So where Iran's nuclear program is today, where it has close to enough enriched material for a nuclear weapon, it will be able to do that legally in 9 years. The only difference is there will be zero sanctions on Iran's program, and we won't be able to sanction Iranian oil exports at all. So we will have zero leverage 9 years from now when that happens. The IRGC, to the degree to which the IRGC is involved in the nuclear program itself, is debatable. And again, you can look at some of the research that you mentioned, but it is certainly going to be helping advance Iran's security and terror interests around the world. Which will really be used to threaten countries like Israel, like UAE and Saudi Arabia, and basically saying if the United States or Israel wants to, take out Iran's nuclear program, Iran is going to try to create a deterrent through the IRGC to make it very, very painful for other countries.
Is this deal really about stopping Iran from getting nuclear weapons? Because from what you're saying, it doesn't sound more than even a shorter pause in the program than the JCPOA ever was. Is it more about Biden trying to get cheap Iranian oil at this time, as he had repeatedly told his American audiences concerned about the gas prices? What's the real reason for
Well, this is a little speculative because, frankly, the Biden administration has not given any answer to that question. They have not done any speeches. They have not written any strategy that's been released publicly. All they have given is a couple talking points. My personal view is that Rob Malley and others at the State Department want to fundamentally realign the Middle East. They want to put Iran in terms of parity with folks like UAE and Saudi Arabia, who we know that the Biden administration doesn't really care for and is not seeking a close relationship with. And they're trying to empower Iran through this deal, through allowing them to have $90 billion in sanctions relief. And they are seeking to remake the Middle East. That was President Obama's explicit strategy, and it hasn't been repudiated by this administration. A lot of the top folks who negotiated the Obama deal are doing the exact same negotiations today for President Biden, which is one of the reasons we have such bad outcomes today.
We are already seeing the fallout from some of the decisions related to this process, from the allowing Houthis to be taken off the FTO list. Not only has the terrorism in the region increased substantially since that happened, and with the Houthis now also attacking UAE, but we are seeing that diplomatically, we're in the middle of a crisis of Ukraine and Saudi Arabia, and UAE won't even pick up Biden's calls. What do you think would be the political effect of the lifting of the sanctions from IRGC and some of these other entities?
I think it's going to be, well, one, domestically in the United States, there's a massive domestic backlash against that. 12 House Democrats just wrote a letter basically saying that would be extremely concerning and would probably cause them to vote against any deal. Republicans are completely aligned in opposition to this deal. But you'd also see this as a betrayal. The Israelis and the Arab nations would see this as a betrayal. Look, publicly, they aren't criticizing this very much because they're afraid to jeopardize the relationship they have with the United States, which is already very fraught. But behind the scenes, both Arab and Israeli leaders are furious about this. And I know that because I hear from them and they talk about just how frustrated they are with the concessions being made by the United States in negotiations in Vienna. The IRGC delisting would really show a troubling lack of commitment to fighting terrorism and fighting Iranian aggression throughout the region.
What, if anything, can Congress do to stop these deals? Which of the sanctions are congressional and cannot be undone without Congress's concessions, and what steps have been taken to basically to go around Congress? You mentioned that in your tweets, if not in the article, that there's some creative approaches supposedly being uh, discussed by the lawyers in the Biden administration. What are we talking about here?
Well, look, the U.S. law says that Biden has to submit any deal to Congress for a 30-day review period before sanctions can be lifted. These sanctions are mandated, the vast majority of these sanctions are mandated by Congress. There are some which are the purview of the executive branch. But the law that Congress put in says that either way, they have to go before Congress for review. My sources are telling me the administration is planning to basically do the very bare minimum necessary in doing this and really will not give Congress a say. There are advanced ways that Congress can and creative ways that Congress can act to block this deal. I don't want to say more about that because they're very sensitive, but it is rather unlikely that they will be successful as long as Democrats control both the Senate and the House. And so it would be for political messaging. But the reality is that Republicans are going to take back the House a year from now, and they're very likely to take back the Senate as well. And when that happens, they're going to act very strongly to reverse everything that President Biden is doing in these negotiations right now. And so, certainly if Republicans take the White House back in 3 years, they will leave the deal and rip it up. But it could be even shorter a period of time. It could just be basically a 10-month deal before Congress comes back in Republican hands and they act to reverse most of what's happening right now in Vienna.
So if that's happening, why is either Biden, Iran, or anyone else involved even bothering?
Well, that is a great question. I think you would have to ask the Biden administration. It's unclear to me. I think this is also why you've seen a lot of Iranian hesitancy about going back into the deal, because they're saying, you guys don't even have the ability to guarantee that this deal would last more than 3 years. And so you've seen a lot of Iranians say, this doesn't make sense for our interests either, because it will be quite short-lived. But for Iran, there's still significant interest because they would get 3 years of reprieve from sanctions. They'd be able to export oil again. And look, Iran is facing a massive fiscal and financial collapse. They have a debt crisis, which is out of control. It is threatening to overtake their whole economy because they haven't been able to export oil, but also because of bad fiscal mismanagement. And so Iran is desperate for financial relief, even if it is short-lived and only lasts 3 years. It's still for them necessary and better than nothing.
And in the meantime, they've also been able to get concessions along the way, which caused significant problems for the US, but helped the Iranian operations in the region, that's for sure. Now, the Russian ambassador mentioned essentially that US has been duped by this deal and that Russia, China, and Iran had benefited from this process. How would you assess that statement?
Well, look, Russian Ambassador Mikhail Olanov went on Iranian state TV for 22 minutes, crowing about how he had played the United States, how they had worked together with Iran, together with China, to conduct dozens of victories at the negotiating table over the United States and the West. And basically said that this was a great deal for Iran, that Iran got much more than Iran expected, or that any of the other negotiators expected in these deals. That should really worry both members of the United States, people in the Middle East. They haven't seen the full text yet. I've been told a lot of the details. But what's clear is that when the details come out, this is going to be a disastrous deal. That is going to do huge damage to the stability and security of the Middle East.
What you're telling us in the article, in the tweets, and right now is bad enough, but this is what is becoming public information. We have seen with the JCPOA a lot of side deals that didn't come out until years later, much to everyone's surprise. What can we expect in terms of that from the current negotiations? Could Ulyanov have been referring to some secret arrangements that are not privy to Congress, to career sources, and only to an arrangement of a few members of the top administration echelons?
That's possible. I do not know what I do not know. What I know is that there is a text between 20 and 30 pages long that should be submitted to Congress, that should be visible to the American people so that we can evaluate what is happening here in the deal. I think that deal itself is going to be very bad. I think it's going to be full of concessions, but it's going to be, and then that even that document is just sort of an addendum to the original JCPOA, which we already know was a massive giveaway to Iran and did not serve U.S. interests or the interests of our allies and partners.
Since these revelations came out, the reaction of Congress has been, in public at least, has been relatively muted, and in the media there's been some concerns expressed, but nothing seems to be more than the usual during this entire process. Why do you think there's been such limited? Is it the Ukrainian situation, or is it lack
Well,
of
I would
understanding?
disagree slightly. There's actually been a huge outcry from Congress on this issue, particularly in the Senate. Just yesterday, there was a large press conference held in the Senate with opposition to the deal from a lot of the leading senators, including the chairman, the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and other powerful senators. There is a growing awareness now of just how bad this deal is among Congress. The issue is the media is very preoccupied with Russia and Ukraine. They don't have a lot of bandwidth to cover Iran right now. But I also think it's because they don't want to cover Iran. They don't want to highlight all the bad things that are happening in this deal, because some of them are ideologically, they for one reason or another, they have some ideological affinity towards this deal and don't want to see it fail.
Now, we have seen one possibility that has bothered me since the beginning of all of this. I mean, we know that Putin likely miscalculated the extent of Ukraine's resistance and willingness to fight, and so on and so forth. But signs are pointing to the fact that Biden Biden seemed to have linked Russia's willingness to assist in the Iran deal with essentially sidestepping the Ukraine issue and allowing Putin to proceed as planned without taking any preemptive action, and very early on basically saying that NATO would not be involved on that issue. And increasingly statements coming from Pentagon and from others seem to be far-fetched in terms of the actual danger of trying to stop Putin, because we have already given lethal aid like Stingers and nothing happened. No one was nuked. No NATO member has been attacked other than with cyber attacks, which were ongoing before invasion. Do you think this arrangement with Russia and the Iran deal in play, does Biden not, is he not seeking alternative mechanisms to negotiate it, and how much is he willing to give to Russia for this very dubious deal, given what's happening?
Well, it's interesting that you talk about, our failure to deter Russia. I think the problem was that both Europe and the United States appeared extremely weak. We weren't willing to threaten real significant sanctions against Russia, and Russia calculated and said the costs wouldn't be very high. Now, since then, I think we've seen that the costs on Russia have actually been quite higher than I expected, than almost anyone else expected. I think European resolve has been much more positive. They're moving to ban Russian imports of Russian oil. But the problem is it was too late. The intent was to stop a war with Russia, not merely to create costs once they did it. Now we already have a war. We have hundreds and thousands of Ukrainians dying. We have Ukrainian cities being shelled and demolished. Yes, we can create costs and impose consequences, but what would have been much, much better is to stop a war in the first place. And the Biden administration's theory of deterrence has simply failed. I think that's very similar to what we see in Iran. There's a lack of willingness to actually show and demonstrate that we're willing to take action, strong action, to stop an Iranian bomb. And so Iran isn't afraid. They don't believe that there will be consequences. And so they're using that to their advantage in these negotiations.
Now, I know you have to leave shortly, so one last question before we go, which is already we have seen the regional diplomatic consequences for the US from pursuing this course of action, the lack of closeness, to put it mildly, with Saudi Arabia, with UAE, even Israel kind of shifting to other diplomatic arrangements, countries not voting automatically with the US on the Russian issue. all of that, they may be seeking out their own interests, but all of that benefits Iran, Russia, and China the most. We are seeing Chinese trying to build military bases in UAE and Saudi Arabia, produce various operations. Not that that helps against Iran or Houthis, as we are also seeing there was another attack on the refinery. There's concern in Bahrain about being taken over by Iran, quite frankly. What do you see happening as a result of these divisions? How do you see Iran, Russia, and others exploiting it in the months to come?
Well, what I see is if Iran gets access to $90 billion and it starts increasing funding to its militias and to its terror proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis and the proxies in Iraq, what we're going to see is more conflict emerge in the Middle East. And Russia is actually the one that stands to benefit from that the most because they're the arms dealer of choice to most countries in the Middle East. And Iran will have more money to buy weapons from Russia itself. And so I think Russia stands to gain a lot. China's primary interest in the Middle East is economic. They want to buy and sell. They want to buy oil from the Middle East. They want to sell them goods. I'm not, in my view, it shouldn't be in China's interest to see all this discord and destabilization. But what we often fail to remember is that China's primary interest right now is doing anything it can to degrade and destabilize the United States and our interests around the world, because they're gearing up for a fight over Taiwan and fight with U.S. interests. And so whatever they can do to sort of stymie our interests around the world, they will do. They probably know that this deal is bad for the United States and for our Arab allies, and that's why they're supporting it. But frankly, this is not a top priority for China. China has a lot of other priorities and focuses. Iran is fairly low down the list for
that. Essentially, it looks like we've sown the seeds of our own political, if not destruction, but at least challenges in the years to come. And whoever comes after Biden will have a hell of a job trying to undo the damage politically as well as security-wise. Which let's hope that somebody like that emerges sooner rather than later, because there's a lot of this is being ingrained in the U.S. politics. You mentioned congressional dissent from this, but at the same time, there is concern that the polarization in the U.S. has reached such a height that in the future it will be difficult to bring forth to the office people who will understand the security repercussions. We're already seeing a lot of Russian propaganda split the GOP, among other things. So that's certainly going to be a concern. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a very thoughtful, though disturbing look at the latest developments in Vienna talks. We are being told that they're on the brink of collapse, but we've been hearing that since day one. So I remain skeptical.
I hope so, but I fear it will not.
Yeah, right. Thank you so much, and hopefully we can talk in the future about more positive developments on that front.
So too. Thanks for having me, Irina.
Thank you.